The alarm on the station woke me before my own body did. Red light. A low hum through the floor. Somewhere above my head, a voice I did not recognize was speaking in a language that had not existed 20 years ago. A language built just so every species in this place could argue with each other without waiting for a translator to catch up. I sat up in a chair built for a body twice my width and I asked the room a simple question. What happened? The answer came from a small floating device near the ceiling, its light blinking green, then amber, then green again, like it could not decide how worried to be. A dispute has escalated in Chamber 4, it said. Human representative, your presence is requested immediately. I want to be clear about something before I go any further into this. My name is Ethan Cole. I did not ask to be the only human standing in a room built for thousands of delegates from hundreds of worlds. Nobody back home handed me a medal or a title that meant anything. I was a translator. I spoke 6 languages and understood the shape of a few dozen more. And when Earth needed to send exactly one person to the Galactic Council, my name came up because I did not have a family that would worry, and because, frankly, nobody else wanted the job. I walked out of my quarters into a hallway built from a material that looked like glass but felt warm under my hand, like something alive. Other delegates moved past me in groups, clusters of them. Advisors walking behind ambassadors, guards walking behind advisors, aides carrying data slates and translation devices and small containers of whatever their species needed to breathe or eat or simply survive being away from home. I walked alone. I had walked alone since the day I arrived. At first I told myself this was normal. Earth was new here. We had only been allowed inside the council 8 months earlier, after decades of what the official records called observation, and what I privately called being watched like an animal, in a very large, very quiet cage. It made sense, I told myself, that a new member would not yet have the resources for a full delegation. It made sense that I would be walking these halls without a translator team, without security, without a single other human face for 100 light years in any direction. I had told myself a lot of things in the last 8 months that turned out not to be true. I reached Chamber 4, and the doors opened without me touching anything. Inside, the noise hit me first. Dozens of voices raised at once, translated into a dozen different tones, all of them urgent. I stepped through the doorway and the noise stopped. All of it. At once. I have seen a room go quiet before. I have not seen a room go quiet the way that room went quiet. It was not the silence of people finishing a thought, it was the silence of people remembering something they had been trying very hard not to think about. 2 delegations stood facing each other across the central floor. One species I recognized, tall and pale, with skin like polished stone and voices that came out low and slow, careful with every word. They were called the Doran, and in 8 months I had learned they almost never raised their voices, not even in disagreement. They were raising their voices now. Across from them stood a species I did not know, shorter, built low and wide with too many joints in their arms and a way of moving that reminded me of insects on a warm day, quick and sharp. Between the 2 groups on the floor sat a metal container the size of a suitcase, its lid open, its contents spilled across the tiles. Some kind of mineral, blue, faintly glowing, valuable enough that both sides looked ready to come to physical harm over it. A council mediator. A thin creature with 4 eyes set in a ring around its head, turned toward me the moment I entered and spoke before I had taken 3 steps. Human representative, we did not summon you for mediation. This dispute does not involve Earth. I said, then why was I called? The mediator's 4 eyes moved independently, 2 toward me, 2 toward the arguing delegations, and for a moment nobody answered. Then one of the insect-like delegates, the shorter species I had not yet learned the name of, pointed one long jointed limb directly at me and said something in its own language, fast and sharp, before the translation caught up. The translation arrived a half-second later, flat and mechanical in my ear. We invoke the human presence clause. Let it be known Earth is a witness to this dispute. Let it be recorded that Earth saw what was done here. I stood there in the doorway, still half asleep, still confused. And I understood exactly nothing about what was happening. I did not know what a human presence clause was. I had never heard the phrase before in my life, but I watched the Doran delegation, the tall, calm, stone-skinned diplomats who had not raised their voices in 8 months, go very still and very quiet, and I watched every single one of them look at me instead of at their opponents. Not with anger, not with the frustration of a dispute interrupted. With something closer to fear. The lead Doran ambassador, an elder named Vesak who had shaken my hand on my first day here with something like polite curiosity, stepped back from the mineral container as though it had suddenly caught fire. He turned to the mediator and spoke in a voice so quiet I almost missed the translation. "Withdraw the claim," he said. "We withdraw the claim. Return the shipment. There is no dispute." The insect delegation, the ones who had called me into the room, made a sound that I can only describe as satisfaction, a series of clicks that needed no translation at all. The mediator's eyes settled on me one final time, and it said, in a tone that was trying very hard to sound official and administrative and not at all unsettled, "Thank you, human representative. Your presence is no longer required." I left the chamber the same way I had entered it, alone, confused, and, for the first time since arriving at this station, genuinely afraid, not of anything I understood, but of everything I did not. I want you to understand something about how the Galactic Council actually works, because on the surface it looks like every meeting hall you have ever seen in a film about the future. Rows of seats. Translators. Ambassadors in strange clothing arguing about trade routes and resource rights and territorial lines drawn across systems that do not care about lines at all. But underneath all of that, the Council runs on old agreements, old fears, old memories that nobody writes down anymore because everybody who matters already knows them by heart. I did not know them by heart. I had been here 8 months and I still did not understand the most basic fact about my own presence in this place. A fact that every other species in the room seemed to understand instinctively. The way you understand not to put your hand on a hot stove without ever having been told. That night, back in my quarters, I opened a channel to Earth. It took 11 seconds for the signal to bounce across the relay stations and reach the small office in Geneva, where a woman named Laura Bennett sat behind a desk that was, as far as I could tell, always covered in paperwork regardless of the hour. She answered on the second ring, the way she always did, like she had been waiting. "Ethan," she said, "you look tired." "I am tired," I said. "I need you to tell me something, and I need you to not give me the diplomatic answer this time." She leaned back in her chair. On the screen behind her I could see the edge of a window, gray daylight, the ordinary world going on without me. "What happened?" she asked. I told her about the chamber, the mineral, the Doran delegation backing away from me like I was something dangerous, the phrase, human presence clause, that nobody had ever explained to me, that had apparently ended a dispute between two other species the instant I walked through a door. Laura was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I checked the connection to make sure it had not dropped. "Laura," I said, "what am I not being told?" She rubbed her eyes, the way she did when she was deciding how much of the truth to give me, and she said, "There's a file. It's old. It predates your posting by a long time, and it predates the Council's decision to let humanity join by even longer. I don't have full access to it either, Ethan. Nobody in this office does. But there's a reason Earth only sent one person." I said, "I thought that was a budget decision." Her expression did not change, but something behind her eyes did, and that was worse than if she had simply looked afraid. "That's the story we tell at home," she said. "It's not the whole story." I asked her what the whole story was. She looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look someone gives you right before they decide you are old enough to hear something they had hoped to keep from you a while longer. "I don't know all of it," she said. "I know it's in the Council archive. I know it's classified above my clearance, and I know that whatever it is, it's the reason every species out there treats a single unarmed human like he's standing in the room with a loaded weapon nobody can see." I sat with that sentence for a long time after the call ended. Outside my window, the station turned slowly against a field of unfamiliar stars, and somewhere in that turning I understood that I had been sent here not because Earth had nothing else to offer, and not because nobody else wanted the job, though that part was still probably true. I had been sent here because one human, alone, unarmed, quiet, was apparently already more than the rest of the galaxy knew how to handle. I did not sleep again that night. I lay awake instead, turning the words over in my mind. Human presence clause, withdraw the claim, there is no dispute. Something had happened before I ever arrived here. Something that had taught an entire galaxy of species who had never met me personally, who knew nothing about my life or my history or my intentions, to treat the mere sight of a human being as a reason to stop whatever they were doing and back away. I did not know yet what that something was, but I intended to find out, and somewhere deep in my chest, underneath the fear and the confusion, a small and stubborn part of me had already decided that I was not going to stop asking until somebody finally told me the truth. 3 days passed before I was called into a full session of the council, and in those 3 days I did what any reasonable person would do when told a secret exists but not what it contains. I asked questions. Carefully, quietly, to anyone who seemed willing to talk to me. Most of them were not willing. I tried the Doran first, since it was their reaction in Chamber 4 that had started all of this. I found one of their junior aides in a corridor near the dining hall, a young Doran named Fessa who had always been more talkative than the rest of her delegation, more curious about Earth, more willing to ask me questions about human food and human music during the long, quiet stretches between sessions. I asked her, as gently as I could, why her ambassador had backed away from the mineral dispute the moment I walked into the room. She stopped walking. Her stone-gray skin seemed to lose a shade of its color, and she looked past me, down the corridor, checking who else might be listening. "I should not discuss this," she said. I told her I was not trying to get her in trouble. I told her I genuinely did not understand, and that not understanding was starting to frighten me more than whatever the answer might be. She considered that for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "We are taught the history of your species before we are old enough to serve on any delegation that might one day sit near a human representative. It is part of our training. It is required." I asked her what that history contained. She shook her head. A gesture I had learned meant something close to regret. "I am not senior enough to discuss the details," she said, "but I can tell you this much, because I think it is kind to tell you. It is not that we believe you are dangerous, Ethan. It is that we believe you do not know your own strength, and that frightens us more than if you did." She walked away before I could ask anything else, and I stood alone in that corridor for a long time, turning her words over, trying to understand a sentence that felt like it had been built specifically to explain nothing, while sounding like an explanation. I tried a different approach the next day. I requested access to Earth's historical file through the Council archive, using the same standard procedure any new member species was entitled to use. It was, on paper, a simple administrative request. Every member species had the right to review its own recorded history within the Council's systems, a transparency measure put in place generations ago to prevent exactly the kind of situation I now found myself in. The request came back denied within an hour. I submitted it again, this time attaching a formal note explaining that as Earth's sole representative, I required this information to perform my duties adequately. The response took 2 days this time, and when it came, it was not a denial. It was worse. It was silence, followed by a visit. The visit came from a council administrator I had not met before, a tall, thin being with skin the color of ash and a voice that never seemed to rise or fall, no matter what it was saying. It introduced itself only as Registrar Thane, and it met me in a small office near the archive wing, a room with no windows and only one door. "Your request has been noted," Registrar Thane said. "Full access to Earth's historical file requires authorization above the level currently held by any Earth representative." I asked what level that would require. "Full ambassadorial status, granted by unanimous council vote," it said. "Earth currently holds provisional status only." I asked why. I asked what could possibly be in a file about my own species that required more authorization than the file itself would need to explain. Registrar Thane's expression, if it had one at all, did not change. "That information is not something I am permitted to discuss," it said. "What I can offer you is limited access. A summary file. Heavily redacted, but real." I said I would take it. It took another full day for the summary file to arrive, delivered not through the council's usual channels but hand-carried by a junior archivist who would not meet my eyes when she gave it to me. I read it alone, in my quarters, late at night, with the lights turned low and the station humming quietly around me. Most of it was exactly what I expected. Standard first contact reports. Records of the early scans the council had run on Earth decades ago, long before I was born. Long before anyone on Earth even knew we were being watched. Population data, technological assessments, notes on human languages, human governments, human culture, all written in the careful, clinical tone of an outside observer trying to understand a species from a distance. Then I reached a section near the middle of the file, and everything about the tone changed. It began with a single line. Incident designation 741. Location, outer system, designation withheld. Species involved, human, 3 individuals. Outcome, classified above provisional access. Below that line, almost the entire page had been blacked out. Not summarized, not paraphrased, simply removed, whole paragraphs replaced with solid black bars, as though whoever had prepared this file had decided that even a redacted summary of the truth was too dangerous to share. What remained were fragments. A date, Decades before my posting, before Earth even knew the Council existed, a location far outside our solar system, a place no human ship should have had any reason to be. A note, half-sentence, cut off mid-word, that read, response time from initial contact to resolution, under 4 minutes. And then, at the very bottom of the page, a single line that had somehow survived the redaction, either by mistake or, I would later come to believe, on purpose, left there deliberately so that anyone reading this file would understand exactly how seriously to take it. It read, all observing species agreed unanimously, effective immediately, to limit direct human contact to the smallest number necessary. This decision remains in effect. I sat with that page for a long time. Outside my window, the stars turned slowly, indifferent to what I had just read, and I felt something shift in my chest. A cold, quiet understanding that had been building since the moment I walked into Chamber 4 3 days earlier. This was not about budgets. This was not about Earth being a new and unproven member of the Council, still finding its footing among older, wiser species. This was about an event, decades old, that had happened before I was born, involving 3 human beings whose names I did not know, in a location I would probably never learn, that had ended in under 4 minutes, and had frightened an entire galaxy so badly that they had built a policy around never letting it happen again. I did not sleep that night either. The next morning, I was summoned to a full council session, the largest gathering I had attended since my arrival. Every delegation was present, filling the enormous chamber with the low murmur of 100 different languages layered over each other, waiting for translation, waiting for order. I took my seat at the table meant for 12, alone as always, and I noticed something I had not noticed before, now that I knew what to look for. The guards stationed around the chamber, usually positioned near the doors and the more volatile delegations, were positioned differently today. 2 of them stood near my table. Not close enough to seem hostile, just close enough to seem prepared. An elder I had not yet spoken with directly, an ambassador from a species called the Corel, rose to open the session. She was old, her fur silvered with age, her movements slow and deliberate in the way that suggested decades, maybe centuries, of practice in rooms exactly like this one. Before we begin today's agenda, she said, her translated voice carrying easily across the chamber, I wish to address something that has been raised in private discussions among several delegations this week. The room went quiet, and I felt every eye that could turn toward me. Earth's representative has requested full access to his species' historical file, she continued. This request has been denied, per long-standing council policy. I understand this denial may feel, to him, like an insult, or a sign of mistrust. She paused, and for a moment her old, tired eyes settled directly on mine, and there was something in them I had not expected. Not suspicion, not fear, not exactly. Something closer to sorrow. I want to assure the human representative, she said, that this policy exists not because we believe he intends harm. It exists because we have learned, at great cost, that intention has very little bearing on outcome where his species is concerned. A murmur moved through the chamber, and I felt my face go warm, embarrassment and confusion tangled together into something I could not name. I raised my hand, the small human gesture that had, over 8 months, become the signal the council recognized as my request to speak. The elder nodded, granting it. I said, with as much calm as I could manage, I would like to understand what happened. Not because I want to challenge your policy, because I am asking you honestly to help me understand my own species, since apparently nobody at home has ever told me the full truth either. The chamber was silent for a long moment. Then the old Corel ambassador said something that I would carry with me for the rest of my time on that station, something that answered nothing and everything all at once. Perhaps, she said, that silence is the kindest thing we have ever done for you. The session moved on to other matters after that. Trade agreements, border disputes, the ordinary business of a galaxy full of species trying to live alongside each other without ever fully understanding one another. But I did not hear much of it. I sat at my table built for 12, alone, turning that sentence over and over in my mind, and I understood, with a certainty that settled into my bones like cold water, that I was not going to stop until I knew exactly what my own people had done to earn a silence so careful, so deliberate, that an entire galaxy had agreed to protect me from my own history. It took me 2 more weeks to find someone willing to tell me the truth, and when I finally did, it was not through the archive, and it was not through the council at all. It came from a Corel researcher named Odal, a quiet, elderly scholar who worked in the historical wing of the station, cataloging records that most delegations had long since stopped caring about. I had met him once before, briefly, during my first month on the station, when I had gotten lost looking for the dining hall, and he had walked me there himself, patiently, without complaint. He was one of the only people on that entire station who had never once looked at me the way the others did, with that careful, measured distance. I found him again in the historical wing, surrounded by shelves of physical records, an old habit from a species that still valued paper and ink alongside their digital archives. He looked up when I entered, and something in his expression told me he had been expecting me. "You have been asking questions," he said. "It is not a question, it is simply a fact he is stating." I told him I had. I told him about the redacted file, the fragments I had managed to read, the strange, sorrowful way the Corel elder had spoken to me in the full session. I told him I was tired of half-answers and careful silences, and that I would rather know the truth, whatever it was, than keep living inside a mystery that everyone else in the galaxy seemed to understand except me. Odal was quiet for a long time. Then he set down the record he had been holding and gestured for me to sit across from him at a small worn table. "I am old enough to remember when it happened," he said. "Most of the delegates on this station were not yet born. I am, perhaps, one of the last people here who witnessed it directly, through the observation relay, as it unfolded in real time." He folded his hands and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as gentle. "I will tell you," he said. "But I want you to understand something first. What I am about to describe is not a story about cruelty. It is not a story about your species doing something wrong. It is, if anything, a story about your species doing something almost unbearably right, and about how deeply that frightened everyone who watched it happen." I told him I was listening. 43 years ago, he began, before Earth had any knowledge that species beyond your own existed, a small human research vessel was traveling through a region of space your people had not yet mapped. It carried 3 crew members. They were not soldiers, they were not explorers in the sense your species usually means. They were scientists, studying a strange signal your instruments had detected, a signal none of you understood yet. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Unknown to your people, that region of space was contested, claimed by 2 other species who were, at that time, in the early stages of what would become a long and bitter conflict over territory and resources. Your small vessel drifted into the edge of that conflict without any understanding of what it had found. And one of the 2 warring species, seeing an unfamiliar ship with unfamiliar technology, made the decision to seize it, believing it might belong to their enemy, or might be valuable enough to claim regardless. They took the vessel," Odal said. "They took the 3 crew members aboard it. And they did not know, because nothing in the galaxy at that time knew, what they had just done." I felt my chest tighten, waiting for the rest. "Word reached Earth through channels your government did not yet understand," he continued. "A distress signal, garbled, incomplete, the kind of transmission that takes days to even confirm is real. By the time your people understood that 3 of their own had been taken, held against their will, somewhere beyond the edge of your solar system, in territory belonging to species they did not know existed, most of the galaxy assumed the matter was already over. Assumed, as we so often did in those days when dealing with a species this young, that Earth had neither the means nor the knowledge to respond." He looked at me steadily. "Earth responded," he said, "in under 4 minutes. I asked him what that meant. 4 minutes from what, to what? 4 minutes, he said, from the moment your people located the vessel holding your crew, to the moment your crew was recovered, unharmed, and the situation was resolved entirely." I sat very still, waiting for him to continue, and for a long moment he did not. "You must understand," he said finally, "that at the time, your species had no functioning relationship with either side of that conflict. No treaties, no history, no understanding of the politics or the power involved. What your people had, instead, was a very simple, very old kind of clarity. 3 of yours had been taken. That was the entire calculation. Nothing else mattered to the response that followed. Not the risk, not the odds, not the fact that the species holding your people possessed technology, at that time, considerably beyond your own." I asked him, quietly, what happened during those 4 minutes. Odal was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had grown even more careful. "I will not describe the details to you," he said. "Not because I wish to protect you from them, but because the details themselves are not the important part, and dwelling on them does neither of us any good. What matters, Ethan, what the entire galaxy understood in the aftermath, was the shape of what had happened, not soldiers arriving with an army, not a negotiation or a demand or a warning given first. A handful of your people, using resources scraped together in a matter of hours, crossing a distance that should have taken days, arriving with no formal authority, no diplomatic standing, no permission from anyone, and leaving, 4 minutes later, with their people recovered, and the situation resolved so completely and so quickly that the species responsible never fully understood what had happened to them until it was already finished. He met my eyes. There was no negotiation, he said. There was no request. There was no warning given, and no mercy asked for, because none had been asked of them either. 3 of yours had been taken, and your people simply decided, collectively, immediately, without hesitation or debate, that this was not going to be allowed to stand, and then it did not stand. I sat there, trying to absorb what he was telling me, trying to picture 3 ordinary scientists, taken from a research vessel, and a response so fast, so total, that it had ended before most of the galaxy even understood it had begun. That is what frightens us, Odal said quietly. Not that your species is cruel. I do not believe you are cruel, Ethan. I have watched you for 8 months, and I have found you to be thoughtful, and patient, and, if anything, more gentle than many of the delegates who sit across from you every day. What frightens us is that beneath that gentleness lives a kind of resolve we do not fully understand, one that requires no permission, no committee, no lengthy debate. A resolve that, once triggered, moves faster than any diplomatic process any of us have ever built, and cannot be reasoned with, or slowed, or stopped, once it has begun. He leaned back in his chair. We do not fear what you would choose to do, he said. We fear what your species has already shown us it is capable of doing, without hesitation, the moment it decides the choice has been made for it. I asked him, my voice quieter than I meant it to be, what happened afterward, to the species that had taken the crew. Their government issued an apology within the week, he said. A formal one, the first contact many species in this region had with your government at all, delivered not because your people demanded it, but because they understood, immediately and completely, exactly what they had almost provoked, and how close they had come to a conflict none of them could have survived. He paused. That apology, and the incident that preceded it, is the reason the Council adopted the policy you have been asking about, he said. Every species with a presence in this region agreed, quietly, without ever making it official, that the safest thing to do, for everyone, humanity included, was to limit direct human contact wherever possible. Not as a punishment, not as an insult, as a precaution, born from watching what your species is capable of when its people believe they have no other choice. I sat with that for a long time, the historical wing quiet around us, the low hum of the station's systems the only sound. Finally, I asked him the question that had been sitting at the bottom of my chest since the moment he began. Do the people back on Earth know this happened? I asked. Does anyone at home know what those 3 scientists went through, or what the response looked like? Odal's expression softened, and for the first time since I had known him, he looked almost sad. I do not know, he said. That is a question only your own government can answer, and I suspect, given how carefully your representatives have avoided the subject with you, that the truth may be more complicated than either of us would like. I left the historical wing that night with more questions than I had walked in with, but for the first time since arriving at the council, I finally understood the shape of the thing that had been following me through every hallway, every meeting, every quiet, careful glance from delegates who had learned, long before I was born, exactly what my species was capable of when pushed too far. I was not being watched because I was dangerous. I was being watched because, somewhere in my history, in the quiet unspoken part of it that nobody at home had ever thought to explain to me, my species had already proven, once, decisively, and without a single moment of hesitation, exactly how far it was willing to go for 3 of its own people. And every delegate in this galaxy had spent decades hoping, quietly, desperately, that they would never be the reason it happened again. Knowing the truth did not make my job easier. If anything, it made every single day that followed feel like walking across a floor I now knew was made of glass, thin enough that a single wrong step might shatter something none of us were prepared to deal with. I tried, at first, to be smaller, quieter. I softened my voice in meetings. I chose my words with more care than I ever had before, second-guessing every sentence before it left my mouth, terrified that some ordinary human habit, raising my voice slightly to make a point, showing frustration when a negotiation stalled, might be read by the room as the first sign of the thing they had all spent decades hoping never to see again. It did not take long for me to realize that this approach was making things worse. 3 weeks after my conversation with Odal, I was asked to represent Earth's interests in a resource negotiation involving a shared mining route that passed near the edge of our solar system. It was, by every measure I understood, a small matter. A handful of species wanted access to a route that technically fell within a zone Earth had been granted provisional rights to during our admission into the Council. The negotiation should have taken an afternoon. It did not. The delegation pushing hardest for access belonged to a species called the Uran, a proud, ambitious people who had joined the Council only a few years before Earth had, and who seemed determined to prove themselves through sheer persistence in every negotiation they entered. Their lead negotiator, a sharp-voiced official named Preth, pressed the issue for nearly 2 hours, offering smaller and smaller concessions in exchange for larger and larger portions of the route, testing, I now understood, exactly how far a new and unproven member of the Council could be pushed before folding. I held my ground. Politely, calmly, I explained, more than once, that the terms being offered did not reflect a fair exchange, and that Earth was not willing to accept them. Prith did not relent. If anything, my calm seemed to embolden him further, and by the 3rd hour, his tone had shifted from persistent to something sharper, something that, on any other world, in any other negotiation, would have simply been called pressure. "You misunderstand your position here," he said at one point, his translated voice carrying an edge that had not been there earlier. "Your species holds provisional status. You are, in practical terms, a guest at this table. I would advise you to remember that, before refusing terms more experienced delegations would accept without hesitation." Something in me, tired after weeks of careful softness, tired of shrinking myself smaller and smaller in every room I entered, allowed a flicker of my actual frustration to show. I did not raise my voice. I did not lean forward, or clench my jaw, or do anything a human observer would have considered even mildly aggressive. I simply said, with a firmness I had been suppressing for weeks, that Earth would not be accepting the terms as offered, and that I would not be pressured into pretending otherwise, simply because our delegation happened to be smaller than his. The room went silent. Not the ordinary silence of a pause in negotiation, the other silence, the one I had learned, over the past month, to recognize instantly, the silence of a room remembering something it had been trying not to think about. Prith's confident posture faltered. 2 of his aides, seated behind him, exchanged a look I could only describe as alarm, and one of them reached, almost involuntarily, for a small device on the table in front of her, the kind used to signal Council security in the event of an emergency. The mediator overseeing the session, a calm, practiced official who had run dozens of negotiations without incident, rose from her seat with unusual speed. "I believe we should pause this session," she said, her voice carefully neutral in a way that did not match the tension suddenly filling the room. Perhaps a short recess would allow both delegations to reconsider their positions. I looked around the room, confused, and it was only then that I noticed the guards stationed at the chamber's edges had shifted their posture, subtly but unmistakably, toward alertness. Not toward me with hostility. Toward the room itself, as though bracing for something none of them could name but all of them feared. Preth, to his credit, seemed to understand faster than I did what was happening. He raised both hands in a gesture I recognized, across a dozen species now, as something close to surrender, and said, quickly, "There is no need for concern. I withdraw my previous statement. Earth's terms are acceptable. We will discuss alternative arrangements for the remainder of the route." The negotiation ended less than 10 minutes later, with Earth receiving terms considerably more favorable than anything Preth had offered in the previous 3 hours. I left the chamber that day feeling something I had not expected to feel, not pride, not satisfaction, a quiet, unsettled discomfort that followed me back to my quarters and sat with me long into the night. I had not threatened anyone. I had not raised my voice or made any gesture that could reasonably be read as aggressive. I had simply held a firm position, the same way any human negotiator might in any ordinary business meeting back on Earth, and the entire room had reacted as though I had reached for a weapon. I called Laura that night, the exhaustion in my voice apparently obvious enough that she asked me what was wrong before I had said more than 2 sentences. I told her what had happened, the negotiation, Prith's shift from confidence to alarm, the mediator's sudden recess, the guards, tense and watchful, though I had done nothing more than refuse to be pushed around at a bargaining table. Laura listened quietly, and when I finished, she was silent for a long moment before she spoke. "Ethan," she said carefully, "I think you need to understand something about how this is being seen from their side, and I think it might help to hear it plainly, even if it's uncomfortable." I told her to go ahead. "You're not just a diplomat to them," she said. You're the only human most of these species have ever spent real time around. Every choice you make, every reaction you have, every time you get frustrated or firm or even just tired, they're not seeing Ethan Cole having a normal human moment. They're seeing the entire species you represent, and they're measuring every single one of those moments against the one thing they know about us that we don't even fully know about ourselves. I asked her if she meant the incident, the one O'Dall had told me about. She hesitated, and then said quietly, "I did some digging after our last call. Used channels I probably shouldn't have. I found enough to confirm the broad shape of what you were told, though not the details. And Ethan, I think the reason nobody back home has ever told you, or told any of us really, is that our own government isn't entirely sure how to feel about it either. It's not something we're proud of exactly, but it's not something we're ashamed of either. It's just true. It's just what we are, apparently, when it matters enough." I sat with that for a long time after the call ended, staring out at the slow, indifferent turn of unfamiliar stars. Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated itself, small and strange, again and again. A minor dispute over shipping rights ended the moment I stated Earth's position clearly and refused to soften it. A delegation that had spent days pressuring a smaller species over territorial boundaries backed down entirely within an hour of my simply attending the session as an observer, though I said nothing at all. Delegates who had once approached me with polite, professional distance began keeping even greater distance, not out of hostility, but out of something closer to caution, the kind of caution you might extend to a stranger you liked well enough, but whose full strength you had never actually seen, and hoped, sincerely, you never would. I began to understand, slowly and with growing discomfort, that I was no longer being evaluated as a diplomat at all. I was being evaluated as a variable. A single point of potential failure in an otherwise carefully balanced system, one that every delegation on that station now quietly, constantly monitored, hoping I would never be pushed far enough to become the thing they all remembered, the thing none of them had personally witnessed but every single one of them had been raised to fear. I did not want to be that thing. I wanted, more than almost anything else during those long, strange weeks, to simply be a person, a translator who had ended up somewhere much larger than himself, doing his best to represent a species he was still, in many ways, only beginning to understand himself. But the galaxy had already decided who I was before I ever arrived, decided it decades before I was born, in 4 minutes that none of them had ever forgotten and that I, until recently, had never even known about. And the longer I sat with that truth, the more I began to understand that the real danger was not whether I would ever become the thing they feared. The real danger was that they had already decided I might, no matter what I actually did. And a fear like that, quiet and patient and carried for generations, does not simply go away because one man tries, every single day, to prove it wrong. The full truth finally reached me on an ordinary afternoon, in the least dramatic setting imaginable, over a shared meal in the station's quiet dining hall with Fessa, the young Doran aide who had first tried to warn me weeks earlier in that empty corridor. She found me alone at a corner table, picking at food that still, after 8 months, did not quite taste right to my human palate, and she sat across from me without asking, setting down her own tray with the careful deliberateness of someone who had rehearsed what she wanted to say. "I have been thinking about our conversation," she said, "the one in the corridor, weeks ago. I was not honest with you. Not fully. I told myself I was protecting you, but I think, if I am honest with myself now, I was protecting my own comfort more than yours." I put down my fork and gave her my full attention. She glanced around the dining hall, checking, out of old habit, who might be listening, and then she seemed to decide it did not matter anymore. "You know now about the incident," she said. "Odal told you. I know this because he told me he had, and because I can see it in the way you carry yourself now, differently than you did when you first arrived." I told her that yes, I understood the shape of it now, though I still did not fully understand why it had shaped so much of how the council treated me, decades after it happened, involving 3 people who were likely no longer even alive. "There is more," Fessa said quietly. "Something O'Dall may not have told you, either because he does not know it, or because he judged it was not his place to say." I asked her to continue. "The policy you know as the Silence Directive," she said. "The agreement to limit direct human contact, to send only a small number of your people wherever possible. It is not simply something the Council decided to protect itself from your species." She paused, choosing her next words with obvious care. "It is something your own government requested as well," she said, quietly, formally, before Earth was ever granted full knowledge of the wider Council. "Long before you arrived here." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I asked her what she meant. When your leaders were first given a limited account of what had happened, the incident, the response, the 4 minutes that ended it, they were, from what I understand, deeply shaken, she said. Not proud, as some outside your species might assume. Frightened. Frightened of what it revealed about themselves, about what their own people were capable of when the right conditions were met. Conditions none of them fully understood or could reliably predict or prevent. She met my eyes. Your government did not want the wider galaxy to see very much of you, Ethan, she said gently. Not because they were ashamed of you individually, but because they were afraid of what might happen if humans were placed, in numbers, in situations they could not control. A single trusted representative, carefully chosen, closely monitored, seemed to them the safest possible compromise. Enough presence to satisfy the Council's requirements for membership. Not so much presence that the wrong situation, the wrong provocation, might trigger something none of us are prepared to see happen twice. I sat back in my chair, the food in front of me forgotten entirely. So I was not chosen because nobody else wanted the job, I said slowly, working through it out loud. You may have been told that, Fessa said. It may even have been partly true, from the perspective of whoever made the final decision on your posting. But I believe, and this is only my own understanding, gathered from things I have overheard and pieced together over months, that the deeper reason was something closer to this. Earth needed someone your government trusted completely. Someone patient, someone unlikely, by nature and temperament, to be pushed easily toward the edge of that resolve everyone fears. And someone who could be sent alone. Because sending more than one of you, sending a full delegation the way every other species does, was considered, by every party involved, human and otherwise, simply too great a risk. I thought of my own quiet, uneventful life before this posting. The years spent translating trade documents and cultural exchange papers, work so unremarkable that most people I had known considered it a mildly interesting hobby rather than a career. I had never once in all those years imagined myself as someone chosen for stability, for patience, for being, in some clinical, carefully calculated sense, the safest possible version of my own species that anyone could put in front of a room full of frightened strangers. I asked Fessa, my voice quieter than I intended, whether she believed it. Whether she believed I was truly that thing everyone feared, buried somewhere beneath the version of myself I tried to bring into every room. She considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things, and after a long moment she said, I believe every species carries something within it that frightens the others, Ethan. Mine included. We simply do not know the full shape of yours yet, because it has only shown itself once, decades ago, under conditions none of us can fully predict or replicate. That uncertainty is what frightens the Council. Not you, specifically. Not even your species, specifically. The not knowing. We sat together in silence for a while after that, the ordinary noise of the dining hall continuing around us, other delegations eating, talking, laughing in languages I still did not fully understand, none of them aware of the conversation happening quietly in the corner. Finally, I asked her the question that had been building in me since Odal first told me the story weeks earlier. Do you think it will happen again? I asked. The response. The thing everyone is afraid of. Fessa looked at me for a long moment before answering, and when she did, her voice carried a weight I had not heard from her before. I do not know, she said honestly. I do not think anyone knows, including your own people. That is precisely why the Council treats you the way it does, not out of certainty that you will become dangerous, out of the simple, sobering knowledge that if you ever did, nothing any of us have ever built, no fleet, no defense, no treaty, has ever proven capable of stopping it once it begins. She reached across the table then, an unusual gesture for a Doran, whose culture generally avoided physical contact between species, and rested her hand briefly on mine. I do not fear you, Ethan, she said. I want you to know that. I have spent months watching you be patient and careful, and, more than anything else, kind, in a place that has given you very little reason to be. I believe, whatever lives beneath that kindness, it is something you carry with great care and great restraint, and I think that restraint deserves more respect than fear. I thanked her, and I meant it, more than I had meant almost anything I had said since arriving at that station. But even as I sat there, grateful for her honesty, grateful for the first genuine connection I had made with anyone since leaving Earth, I could not shake the growing, uneasy understanding that had been building in me for weeks. I had been sent to this station not as an ambassador, not really. I had been sent as a carefully managed risk, A single, trusted variable, chosen specifically because both my own government and an entire galaxy of frightened strangers believed I was the version of humanity least likely to become the thing that had ended a conflict, decades ago, in under 4 minutes, without asking permission from anyone. And somewhere in the quiet space between that trust and that fear, I began to understand that my presence here was never really about representing Earth in ordinary matters of trade and diplomacy. It was about proving, every single day, in every meeting, every negotiation, every quiet moment where frustration might have shown and did not, that humanity could be trusted to hold itself back. I did not know yet whether that would be enough. I would find out sooner than I expected, and not in a quiet dining hall, not in a careful conversation between two people who had grown, against every expectation, to trust each other. I would find out in a chamber full of watching eyes, when someone finally decided to test, deliberately and without warning, exactly how far that restraint could be pushed before it broke. The test came 3 weeks later, and it came from a species I had barely spoken to during my entire time on the station, a proud, expansionist people called the Carcent, who had joined the Council only a year before Earth had, and who had spent that year quietly pushing the boundaries of every agreement they were party to, testing, always testing, how far the older, more established species would let them go. I would later learn that the Carcent leadership had studied Earth's file extensively, the same redacted summary I had once struggled to access, and had come to a very different conclusion than every other species on that station. Where the Doran and the Corel and nearly everyone else had looked at the story of the 4-minute response and seen a warning, the Carcent had looked at it and seen something else entirely. An old story. Decades old. Unverified by anyone still living in most delegations. Possibly, they had decided, exaggerated by generations of retelling into something closer to myth than fact. They decided to find out for themselves. It began, as these things so often do, with something small. A trade route dispute, similar to a dozen others I had negotiated over the previous months, involving a resource corridor that passed near a system Earth had been granted limited monitoring rights over as part of our provisional membership. The Carcent delegation, led by a sharp, confident commander named Vestral, requested access through that corridor for what they described as routine survey purposes. I reviewed the request carefully, as I reviewed everything, and found nothing objectionable in it on its face. I approved it the same way I had approved dozens of similar requests before, and thought nothing more of it. 2 weeks later, I learned that the survey vessels the Carcent had sent through that corridor had not been surveying anything at all. They had been used to seize a small, unarmed research outpost belonging to a minor species called the Ilbren, a quiet, peaceful people who had only recently joined the Council, and who had no meaningful defense capability of their own. The outpost's small crew, 7 individuals, had been taken into Carcent custody, and the corridor Earth had unknowingly granted access through had been the route used to carry them away. The Ilbrin delegation brought the matter before a full council session, desperate and frightened, pleading for intervention. The Carcent commander, Vestral, stood before the chamber with the calm, unbothered confidence of someone who had already calculated every possible consequence and found none of them concerning. "We acted within contested territory," he said, his translated voice carrying easily through the silent chamber. "The Ilbrin outpost was operating without proper authorization in a corridor recently opened," he added, with a glance in my direction that I understood immediately was deliberate, by Earth's own approval. The chamber turned toward me, dozens of species waiting to see how I would respond to being named, publicly, as the unwitting cause of this crisis. I felt my pulse quicken, but I kept my voice level when I spoke. "The approval Earth granted was for survey purposes only," I said clearly. "It did not authorize the seizure of any outpost, or the detainment of any crew. If that authorization was used as cover for this action, then it was used fraudulently, and Earth withdraws it effective immediately." Vestral did not look concerned. If anything, something in his posture suggested satisfaction, as though I had said exactly what he had been hoping to hear. "A fascinating position," he said, "from a species that famously does not ask permission before acting on matters it considers its own concern. I wonder, human representative, whether Earth intends to demonstrate that famous resolve now, on behalf of a species it barely knows, over a matter so small." The chamber went utterly silent, the particular silence I had come to recognize instantly, the one that meant every delegate in the room understood exactly what was being tested, and exactly how dangerous it was to test it. I felt, for the first time since arriving at that station, the full weight of what everyone around me had spent months fearing. Somewhere beneath the careful, patient diplomat I had trained myself to be, something old and quiet and entirely unfamiliar stirred, Not violent, not immediate, but present, undeniable. The way a held breath becomes impossible to ignore the longer it is held. I thought of the 7 Ilbrin crew members, taken from their own quiet outpost the same way, decades ago. 3 human scientists had been taken from theirs. I thought of Fessa's words in the dining hall. Restraint deserves more respect than fear. I thought of Odal, telling me gently that the story he shared with me was not one of cruelty, but of resolve. I stood, slowly, at my table built for 12, and I addressed the chamber, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. Earth has no formal alliance with the Ilbrin people, I said. No treaty obligates us to act on their behalf. I want that understood clearly, because I do not wish to misrepresent my authority here today. I paused, letting the words settle, watching Vestral's confident posture hold steady, waiting for whatever concession he expected to follow. It did not come. But I would ask this chamber to consider something, I continued. Every species in this room has spent the last year treating my presence with a caution I did not, at first, understand. I have since learned why. I understand now that my species carries within it a history none of you have forgotten, even though most of you never witnessed it directly. A history of responding, immediately and completely, when someone we care about is taken against their will, without hesitation, without waiting for permission, without calculating whether the cost was acceptable first. I looked directly at Vestral. I have spent months trying to prove to this council that Earth can be trusted to hold that history back, I said. I still believe that. I still intend to be exactly that. But I would ask you to consider very carefully what kind of situation you are choosing to create, testing whether a species with that history can simply watch 7 innocent people remain in captivity, taken through a corridor my own hand approved, without feeling any obligation to see it undone. The chamber remained silent, but something in it had shifted, a tension that had not been there a moment before. I am not threatening this chamber, I said, my voice quiet but carrying easily in the stillness. I am telling you, honestly, the same way I have tried to be honest with every delegation on this station since the day I arrived, that you are asking me to prove something none of us, myself included, fully understands the shape of yet. I would prefer, sincerely, that we never find out together. I would ask the Carsent delegation to release the Ilbrin crew, not because Earth demands it, but because it is the right thing to do, and because I do not believe any of us in this room actually wants to discover what happens if that request is refused. Vestral's confidence, for the first time since he had risen to speak, seemed to waver. He glanced around the chamber, and I watched him register, perhaps for the first time, that every other delegation present, the Doran, the Corel, the Urin, even species who had shown me nothing but polite distance for months, were watching him now with something close to alarm, as though he had picked up something in a crowded room that everyone else had spent a long time carefully agreeing never to touch. Release them, one of the Corel elders said quietly, and though her voice was soft, it carried through the chamber with unmistakable authority. Whatever point you believed you were making today, Commander, I would suggest it has already been made, and I would strongly advise you not to press further to see how completely it can be proven. Vestral held his position a moment longer, pride visibly warring with caution behind his eyes, and then, slowly, he inclined his head. The Ilbrin crew will be released within the hour, he said. Our action was, perhaps, based on an incomplete assessment of the corridor's authorization. The chamber exhaled, a collective release of tension I could feel in the air itself, and the session moved quickly to close, delegates filing out in hushed clusters, glancing back at me with expressions I had never quite seen directed at me before. Not fear exactly, and not gratitude either, but something caught uneasily between the two. In the days that followed, I noticed a change in how the council treated me, subtle but unmistakable. Several delegations, the Urin among them, requested private meetings, not to discuss trade or territory, but to gently, carefully, suggest that perhaps Earth might consider reducing its presence in full council sessions going forward. Not withdrawing from membership entirely, they were quick to clarify, simply attending fewer sessions, sending written positions where possible instead of appearing in person, allowing matters to be settled through intermediaries wherever they could be. I understood, listening to them, what they were actually asking. Not that Earth leave the council, that I, specifically, stop reminding them, simply by existing in the room, of exactly how outmatched every defense any of them had ever built truly was, against a species that had once needed only 4 minutes and no permission from anyone. I did not resent them for asking. I understood, better now than I ever had before, exactly what it cost every delegation on that station to sit calmly across from me, meeting after meeting, carrying a fear they had inherited rather than earned, about a history most of them had never witnessed and could barely comprehend. That night, alone in my quarters, I opened a channel to Earth and told Laura Bennett everything that had happened, the Ilbrin crew, Vestral's challenge, the strange, unsettled silence that had followed my response. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You didn't threaten anyone," she said finally, something like relief and pride tangled together in her voice. "No," I said. "I told the truth." That was apparently enough. She was quiet again, and then she said softly, "I think that might be the most human thing you've done since you got there, Ethan. Not the response they're all afraid of. Just telling the truth, plainly, and letting people draw their own conclusions." I sat with that for a long time after the call ended, watching the slow, patient turn of stars I still did not fully recognize, and I thought about everything I had learned since arriving at that station. The redacted file, Odal's careful, sorrowful account, Fess's honesty in a quiet corner of the dining hall. The Council's decades-old fear, carried forward by species who had never met a single human being before me, built entirely on the memory of 3 people, taken and returned within 4 minutes, long before I was born. I understood now why Earth had sent only one of me. Not because I was expendable. Not because nobody else wanted the job. Because a single human being, careful, patient, honest, restrained, was already more than an entire galaxy of frightened, watchful species felt prepared to stand alongside. They had not sent one of me because it was all they could spare. They had sent one of me because, as impossible as it still felt to fully believe, it was, apparently, all the galaxy could handle. 6 months after the Ilbrin crisis, the Council called a formal review of Earth's membership status, the kind of session that only happened when a species' standing was about to change in one direction or another. I sat at my table built for 12, no longer quite so alone as I had once felt, though still, technically, the only human in the room, and I listened as delegation after delegation rose to speak about what they believed my species had proven during its short time among them. I expected debate. I expected caution, the same careful, measured hesitation that had followed me through every hallway since my first day on that station. What I did not expect was the shape the conversation actually took. The Uran delegation, the same species whose negotiator had once tried to pressure me over a mining route, spoke first, and their words surprised me. "We came to this council believing strength was proven through persistence," their new representative said. A calmer official than Preth had been, chosen, I suspected, specifically because of what had happened between us months earlier. "We have since learned there is a different kind of strength, one that does not need to press an advantage simply because it exists. We support Earth's elevation to full ambassadorial status." The Doran spoke next, Vesic himself, the same elder who had backed away from that spilled mineral shipment on my very first day. He looked toward me as he spoke, and there was nothing careful or distant in his expression anymore. "I have watched the human representative for over a year," he said. "I came into this council believing his species was something to be managed, contained, quietly kept at arm's length until we understood it better. I have come instead to believe that understanding will only ever come from proximity, not distance, and that the distance we chose, however reasonable it once seemed, has cost us more in trust than it has ever earned us in safety." Even the Carsent, chastened since the corridor incident, offered no objection, their new representative simply noting, with visible discomfort, that their delegation deferred to the judgment of the wider council on this matter. The vote, when it finally came, was not unanimous. A handful of smaller delegations, still cautious, still carrying old fears they were not yet ready to set aside, abstained rather than oppose outright. But the majority was clear enough that the presiding elder, the same old Corel ambassador who had once told me that silence was the kindest thing the council had ever done for me, rose to deliver the result herself. "Effective immediately," she said, "Earth is granted full ambassadorial status within this council, with all rights and responsibilities such status entails, including full access to its own historical record, unredacted, and the right to expand its delegation as it sees fit." I sat very still, the weight of the moment settling slowly over me, and when the session ended, the old Corel elder approached my table directly, something she had never done before. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly, once the chamber had mostly emptied. "I told you, once, that our silence was a kindness. I have thought about that conversation many times since. I believe now I was wrong. Kindness is rarely built from withholding the truth from someone simply because the truth is difficult to carry." I told her I understood why she had done it, even if I no longer agreed it had been the right choice. and something in her old, tired eyes softened at that. That night, for the first time since my arrival, I was granted full access to Earth's historical file, unredacted, exactly as it had been recorded decades ago by whichever cautious observer had first written it down. I read it alone in my quarters, slowly, carefully, and for the first time I learned the names that had been hidden behind those black bars for so long. The 3 scientists taken from that research vessel had names, ordinary names, the kind you might pass on any street back home. Their mission had been small, almost forgotten by history, until that single incident carved it permanently into a story no living person on Earth had ever fully understood. I learned that all 3 had survived, had eventually returned to ordinary lives, had, in the decades since, quietly declined every request to discuss what had happened to them, not out of shame, the file noted, but out of a simple, private wish to leave that chapter closed. I understood that wish now better than I once might have. Some truths are not meant to be carried loudly. Some are simply meant to be known, quietly, by the people who need to understand them, and left to rest everywhere else. I reached out to Laura the next morning, and told her what I had read. She was quiet for a long time, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried something I had not heard from her before, a kind of careful pride that did not need to announce itself. "I think," she said slowly, "that maybe the reason nobody back home ever fully explained this to you is the same reason the council never did either. Not because we didn't trust you with it, because we didn't know how to carry it ourselves, not yet, and it felt easier to let the silence hold it a little longer." I told her I understood. I told her too that I thought the silence had already held it long enough. In the months that followed, Earth's delegation grew, slowly, carefully, new representatives arriving one at a time, each chosen with the same quiet deliberation that had once brought me here alone. I trained them myself, walked them through the halls I had once walked through so uncertainly, taught them the careful, patient diplomacy I had learned the hard way, in rooms full of strangers who had feared me before they ever truly knew me. I never forgot the weight of that fear, or the reason behind it. I carried it differently now, though, not as a secret pressing against my chest every time I entered a chamber, but as a quiet, steady understanding of exactly what I represented, and exactly what I owed to every species now willing to sit beside me instead of watching me from a careful distance. Odell found me one final time before he retired from the historical wing, an old scholar finally setting down decades of careful, patient work. He told me, in that same gentle voice he had used the day he first told me the truth, that he believed the galaxy was safer now than it had been the day I arrived, not because humanity had grown smaller or gentler, but because it had finally been allowed to be known, fully, honestly, by the people who had once only feared its shadow. "Fear rarely dissolves through distance," he said. "It only grows quieter and waits. It dissolves through understanding, patiently earned, the way you have earned it here, one long, difficult year at a time." I think about that often, now, standing in a chamber that once held only one small table meant for 12, now surrounded by a full Earth delegation that finally fills every seat. I think about 3 scientists whose names I now know, taken and returned in 4 minutes, that shaped an entire galaxy's understanding of what my species could become, if ever it decided the choice had been made for it. And I think, too, about everything that came after, the quiet corridors, the careful conversations, the slow, patient work of proving, one honest moment at a time, that resolve and restraint could live in the same heart, and that a species capable of the first did not have to be defined only by it, if it chose, deliberately and every single day, to be known instead for the second. Earth sent one human to the Galactic Council, once, because it was all any of us, human and alien alike, believed the galaxy could handle. I like to think, now, standing in a room finally full of my own people, that we proved something better was possible instead.